Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks to all of you for joining. It is certainly a timely moment for this book that is prompting our conversation with Ronnie. It is Ronnie. I'm told Americans, we tend to be intimidated by titles, but Sir Ronald Cohen, we have license to call him Ronnie, has written this very engaging and timely book. It is, of course, news to no one that we're having this conversation in the midst of a pandemic that has certainly enhanced the inequalities that millions of people were already extremely concerned about. Long before the pandemic, we were talking about the origins of right-wing populism, of nativism and racism that were being provoked by widening inequality. And the pandemic has exposed the degree to which we are vulnerable to things like global emergencies, and it's, of course, enhanced those inequalities. Ronnie is an ideal person to lead us through a conversation about what we do next. Governments are expending trillions of dollars, trillions of pounds to bail out companies, to supposedly get us back to normal. That's a phrase we keep hearing, but normal, of course, was a place of dire poverty for millions of people, of real enduring insecurity for formerly middle-class people. And so it's fair to say, if the public is going to expend all of this money to return us to something like normalcy, what sort of economy should we seek to have? And this is a subject that Ronnie has not only thought about, but has been very active in directing a process toward improving the situation in terms of inequality for many years. He's a philanthropist, a venture capitalist, a private equity investor, and a social innovator. For nearly 2 decades, he's been working on global efforts to drive private capital to serve social and environmental good. He serves as the chairman of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment at the Portland Trust. And the Portland Trust, he's a co-founder of Social Finance UK, USA, and Israel, and co-founder of chair of Bridges Fund Management, and a former co-founding chair of Big Society Capital. He chaired the G8 Social Impact Investment Task Force, the UK Social Investment Task Force, and the UK's Commission on Unclaimed Assets. And in 2012, he received the Rockefeller Foundation's Innovation Award for Social Finance. He was born in Egypt. He left as a refugee at the age of 11 when his family came to the UK. And again, he's the author of this book being released tomorrow. So why don't we start, Ronnie, by you're just telling us about your own life history and how that brought you to this particular work that you're so interested in.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you for your introduction. Thank you, Paul, for your very kind words. And thank all of you who have joined us for this conversation on the occasion of the launch of Impact. So I started off on the road to venture capital and private equity, motivated by a desire to help create jobs in the UK. And there were 3 million unemployed when I set out, Peter, and also make myself financially independent. And as my career progressed in venture capital and private equity, I began to realize that far from reducing the inequalities that exist in the world, as I had expected to do by backing people who come from very modest backgrounds to make great wealth, I participated in increasing the gap between rich and poor. And at the age of 53, in 1998, I said to my partners, I will leave when I get to the age of 60, because I want to deal with more important issues than just delivering super attractive financial returns. I didn't want my epitaph to read, he delivered a 30% IRR, if you like. And the two issues that really motivated me were social issues and also the Middle East conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So I left APAC in 2005, and 5 years before I left, I got a phone call from the Treasury. And the conversation went something like this. We've been looking at poverty for years and putting a lot of effort into trying to reduce it and all of the social issues that stem from it. Will you have a look at this issue with a more entrepreneurial eye? And that was the beginning of the Social Investment Task Force. And it sort of set me on the road to finding ways of tackling social issues more effectively. Initially, it had to do with ways of bringing investment to charitable organizations that were helping prisoners or the homeless or dropouts from school. But then I began to realize that it was actually part of a much bigger movement in the world. And that's what the book is about.
And tell us briefly, what are the key takeaways that you're hoping an audience will leave with?
So it seems to me that our system is self-defeating at a scale that is just going to lead us to dig ourselves into a deeper and deeper hole. Having a system where companies, in their search for profit, create environmental and social damage, and then governments taxing us to try to cope with it ineffectively because they can't possibly tax us enough to remedy all of the damage that is done, no longer makes sense. It makes sense. It made sense of the time of Adam Smith 250 years ago because the consequences could be handled. But today, with globalization, the consequences can't. And all of us on this call are aware that both environmentally and in terms of social and economic inequality, we have reached the very critical points. So the question is, what do we do about it? And the efforts that impact investment initially made were designed to find ways of attracting investment capital to social entrepreneurs in the way that venture capital had brought funding to tech entrepreneurs. And we did that with the social impact bond and development impact bonds, outcomes funds, and impact capital wholesalers like Big Society Capital. But then I began to realize that the path of impact investment was really the path of optimizing risk, return, and impact. And that our system creates these negative consequences because it just optimizes risk and return. And I realized that technology enables us today to measure the impact of companies very dependably. And if we were to mandate today as governments that companies 2 years from now should begin to publish alongside their regular financial accounts, impact-weighted financial accounts, which take into account the impact that their companies create through their products, their operations, and their employment on people and planet, then investors who are pumping 30 trillion plus today into environmental, social, and governance investment and impact investment would have a much better idea of what they're really investing in. And I make a parallel in the book between our time and 1929 in that respect.
You're putting, in your model, you're putting the onus on the people who control the capital, the people who have benefited mightily from the status quo, to be the ones who are effectively the driving force for altering the status quo and to share more of that wealth with more people. I mean, given what we know about the sophisticated public relations campaigns that corporations have undertaken for decades to try to sort of wrap themselves in the banner of great initiatives, whether it's dealing with climate change or racial inequality, while the world has continued on to get more and more unequal, and while failing to reckon with a lot of the crises that you're concerned about. What do you say to a reader who comes at this and says, "Oh, this isn't a fancier version of philanthropy. This is, we're hoping that the billionaires who go to Davos every year will just somehow develop an appetite to share some of what they've got with everyone else." That's not going to happen. What do you say to that?
I say to them, values are changing and have changed. You have a younger generation which over the past decade has shifted its preferences in buying products to companies whose values they share, which is unwilling to work for companies that are polluting and promoting social problems of one kind or another. And investors have become aware that this has serious implications for the profitability of their companies, which is part of the reason why a third of professionally managed assets in the world, $30 trillion, is going now to investment that seeks to achieve more than just profit. It seeks to achieve profit and environmental and social good. And it isn't philanthropy in the sense that when we think of philanthropy, we think of giving money away. It actually delivers better returns, in my view. To optimize risk return and impact delivers better returns than risk return. And if I may just continue the parallel with 1929, Peter. In 1929, after the crash, investors sat up and said, are we really investing in companies without being able to measure their profit properly and to compare it between companies? Because in those days, as you well know, each company picked its own accounting principles and there were no auditing firms. In 1933, the US took the lead in the world in moving us to generally accepted accounting principles and the use of auditors. And at the time, representations made to Congress stated that this would be the end of American capitalism. Now, we all know this led to the deepening and broadening of our financial system, right, with 200 trillion of investable assets. Today, we're in a situation where investors are sitting up and saying, we don't know what impact companies are creating. Are we really going to continue to invest in companies based only on their profit when we know how much damage they're creating to the environment and to society? And so we have a historic opportunity now to create the same transparency around impact that we have around profit. And by doing that, we would bring impact to the center of our economic system to help provide solutions to the challenges we face instead of creating additional problems all the time.
I take your point about the post-1929 reforms and certainly tremendous advances in terms of transparency, in terms of shareholders understanding what they were purchasing. But of course, we're 12 years removed from, turns out, it's a limited shelf life term, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, in which the credit rating agencies, who were supposedly the arbiters of risk, who were supposed to be warning us if too much of our pension savings or whatever were in risky assets, were basically getting paid by the people who are producing those assets to put their stamp of approval on stuff that proved to be very, very toxic. One could argue, right there is a cautionary tale. Whatever standard you have, whatever system of measurement you have, some very smart, highly compensated people in the city of London, on Wall Street, are going to figure out how to game it and take advantage of it, while once again staking the risks on individuals, on taxpayers, while walking away with most of the profits. How do you prevent that from happening within your model?
I think by measuring impact. If you measure the impact of a financial institution, then the damage that it causes would be reflected in its financial accounts. So whether it's a company or a financial institution, we are oblivious today to the real impact that's being created, which makes us very vulnerable to what we call impact washing today. Companies pointing to the great things they're doing for society and the environment and ignoring completely the negative consequences they're creating, which may dwarf by a huge multiple the positive things that they're talking about. And when you begin to measure impact with the help of technology and the data that is available in the world today, you can begin to look at a financial institution and to say, well, what is its social impact? How much money is it lending to people in need? Is it lending it at a fair price? Is it doing so in a reasonable way, or is its governance askew and enabling its sales force basically to push products that the clients don't need? It's amazing how much you reveal when you begin to measure impact.
But who protects the sanctity of that process? I mean, you don't view this as a voluntary thing. This isn't something companies just get to sign up to do. I mean, what's the mechanism to ensure that we're getting quality information?
Very good question. So in the 30s, there was a big debate about whether governments should be setting generally accepted accounting principles. And the decision was made, no, we can set up a financial accounting board, if you like, to set generally accepted accounting principles. I think we should continue with the same approach. I think we should set up now a generally accepted impact principles effort, led by prominent people whose integrity is completely above reproach, and set off on the same road that we did for financial analysis. And there's the opportunity to do it globally instead of having somewhat different systems in the US and outside the US.
I mean, there are, of course, always differences of opinion about who is beyond reproach. In your book, you spend some time noting, I think it's a really important example, the Business Roundtable, this collection of major CEOs in the States, last year agreed on this new statement of corporate purpose. Gone are the days where Milton Friedman tells us it's only about maximizing profit. The new corporation is now supposed to think about a lot of the things you're concerned about environmental impact, about wages, impacts on communities. Well, a lot of CEOs signed that statement, and we've now lived through the first real test in this pandemic of what happens. And what we've seen is some of the signatories of that pledge have used the money they've gotten from bailouts to furlough their workers while still handing out dividends. There have been layoffs. Help me understand what to make of that history and how these overseers are doing.
So going back to Plato, we have the issue of the guardians and who guards the guardians. And I wouldn't consider, and I would not consider the Business Roundtable to be the guardians. I would consider them to be the players. And I think the guardians would be senior figures from the world of finance and accounting, and from the social world, figures like Mark Carney, for example, or a Paul Pullman, or who was formerly the head of Unilever. There are figures that are committed to making sure that business serves a social purpose as well as making money. And there would not be difficulty in assembling a group of people now to oversee the preparation of generally accepted accounting principles for impact.
Now, you've got some really interesting examples. I mean, this book is not just forward-looking prescriptive. I mean, you do spend some time showing us some vehicles that have actually been in existence for many years. What are some of the highlights to you? What are some of the examples of bonds, for instance, social impact bonds that have worked especially well?
So the social impact bond in itself is a very interesting example, which I spend a bit of time explaining in the book, and basically forecasting its growth and its spread through the use now of independently managed outcomes funds to pay for the results achieved. As almost everyone on this call, because it's the conduit, knows, a social impact bond is a financial security where the return depends on achieving certain metrics in the contract, which are social or environmental. So investors get their money back or not, and the return that increases if the success in preventing prisoners from going back to jail is greater. There are now a couple of hundred social impact bonds across the world, tackling about 15 different social issues in 30 countries. It's time to scale it. But what's interesting about the social impact bond is that it is the purest expression, as I say in the book, of optimizing risk-return impact. And it shows that you can deliver very attractive risk-adjusted returns. You can deliver 5 to 10% annual returns uncorrelated to the stock market or to interest rates, while helping populations that are in need of help. And that money can be recycled as the returns come in. It can be reinvested in different social impact bonds. But we're also seeing green bonds, which are nearly $1 trillion pool of capital now. We're seeing blue bonds for the oceans. We're seeing brown bonds for the soil. And we will continue to see social bonds emerge. There's a big issue of education bonds, which Gordon Brown has been leading, the IFED bond issues. We've seen African countries raise, Côte d'Ivoire has just raised $300 million in a social bond to tide it over to payments, I think, from the World Bank. So there's a host of new securities coming along and changing our investment landscape. But the fundamental change is the shift to risk-return impact thinking, if you like. And impact thinking, in my view, is going to be as transformative of the investment world as risk thinking was 70 years ago. And if I may, I'll just take 2 seconds to talk through risk thinking, Peter, because most people aren't aware of it. But when I kicked off on the road to starting Apax at the age of 26 in the early 70s, the average pension fund or insurance company portfolio or wealthy individual's portfolio had just 2 securities in it, the bonds and the stocks and shares of their country. And then these bright academics at the University of Chicago started to measure risk. And they looked backwards at what movements had been in the prices of the shares of different companies and bonds. And they began to use that to extrapolate future risk. And we got a concept which is called risk-adjusted returns.
Right.
And when you say risk-adjusted returns, it sounds like an obtruse concept. But in fact, it basically says you can include in your portfolio riskier forms of investment that deliver more than proportionately higher returns. What that means is it opened the door to venture capital and private equity, where I was fortunate enough to make my career, which is today a $5 trillion pool of capital, and the venture capital trillion in it funded the tech revolution. So the concept of risk-adjusted returns and diversification, which came in its wake, transformed portfolios to include new asset classes like venture capital, private equity, later hedge funds, and so on and so forth. It also opened the door to investment in emerging markets and globalization.
Right.
So what may sound like an odd academic idea transformed every portfolio on the planet and changed the capital flows throughout the whole system. I believe.
Sorry, go ahead. No,
I'm just going to finish the thought by saying I believe impact thinking will do the same. I believe that when we begin to measure impact through impact-weighted financial accounts, we will see a transformation of portfolios. We will see investors shifting away from companies, and I can give you examples if you're interested, from companies which are polluting much more heavily than their competitors, to companies that are just as profitable and polluting a lot less, and to companies that are not polluting at all, as Tesla, at least through the driving of its vehicles, is doing now, and are transforming their industries. So I believe that impact thinking will, just as risk thinking did, transform the whole investment world. And the investment world will drive the transformation in the corporate world, in the business roundtable participants that you were skeptical about.
Well, I mean, at the risk of getting too into the weeds, mean, the thing about your point about risk-adjusted returns is, this is a way of understanding as an investor how much money I'm going to end up with, or how much money I'm going to have to pay out over the long term. How does the incentive system of the market bring about this revolution in impact investing? I mean, I mean, you're a venture capitalist. Like, why, other than caring about homeless people or the numbers of Americans locked up in prisons, does a venture capitalist suddenly think, oh, I better get some good data on impact and invest accordingly?
I think the reason is that you reduce the risk side and you enhance the return side of the investment equation. You reduce the risk side because you reduce the risk of your consumers, of your talent, of your investors walking away from you because they consider what you're doing to be unacceptable. You also obviously reduce the risk of future regulation and taxation of your activities, okay? At the same time, you open the door to new sets of investment opportunities. Now, you may have thought that clean energy was a very risky thing and therefore unlikely to be profitable. But if you look at an investment in Tesla, which transformed the automobile industry and was set up as an impact venture, in the sense that its aim was not just to make money, but to wean us away from the combustion engine. It's been a superb investment. And so when you begin to think in terms of impact, you create new ways of investing that are even more profitable than the old ones. If you look today at fossil fuel values, and
Right.
if you look at clean energy company values, they're going in completely opposite directions because the world has cottoned on to the fact that the fossil fuel industry is threatened in the long term for all the reasons we've been discussing. So it's good business sense as well as good moral sense, and that's why it's going to spread.
I hear that, but just to come back to the point that you were making about venture capital and technology, I mean, the revolution of the web. I mean, lost in that conversation frequently is the very powerful role that government played. We don't have the internet without American investments in research institutions like UC Berkeley and Stanford, the Defense Department. I mean, we just don't get this technology. Tesla can't sell a single automobile if the government doesn't build a whole bunch of roads. And I mean, part of our problem, one could argue, is that we've allowed market fundamentalism to take over our political sphere, which has been a fancy way of billionaires liquidating public infrastructure and transferring the proceeds into their own coffers. Where does that part of it fit into your conversation? I mean, don't we need some old-fashioned redistribution of wealth to realize the sort of impact that you're most concerned about?
You do need some redistribution of wealth, but redistribution of wealth cannot solve inequality. In order to solve inequality and and increase the diversity to begin to become the norm, we have to get companies to behave differently. Now, it's tough for us to just legislate for companies to increase their diversity to the demographics around their plants. But if you take the figures of Intel, which is a company which has made a real effort to develop diversity in its workforce, if you look at what Intel is paying to its US workforce of 50,000 people, it's about $7 billion a year. But when you begin to look at diversity and the quality of opportunity and the quality of pay, there's a big charge against that wage bill that brings down the positive employment impact of Intel to $2.5 billion a year from $7 billion, okay? Now, shouldn't we be advertising these numbers so that other tech companies' numbers are also available? Government has to legislate to do that. Government has to play the role of an enabler. And if we do that, government doesn't have to legislate that companies must go to a certain diversity level. Governments can signpost that that's what they want, and that's what's desirable. Maybe government can provide tax incentives for the companies that get there first, but investors are going to drive that change. Companies are not going to go there voluntarily because it involves a lot of hard work. And if they're only focused on making money rather than increasing diversity, they won't do it. But if investors are deciding whether to invest in Intel or in its competitors, which are doing a lot worse, then those companies are all going to try to improve their impact performance. And if you look in the environmental area, shouldn't everybody know? I'm against investing in fossil fuels, as you know, but shouldn't everybody know that whether you want to invest in fossil fuels or not, ExxonMobil is delivering $38 billion a year of environmental damage against Shell delivering 22 billion and BP about 12 billion,
right,
with operations of similar size. Wouldn't you want to know that chemical companies like Sasol in South Africa
right,
are delivering environmental damage of 17 billion a year in relation to total sales of 12 billion? Construction, chemical companies. Solvay is delivering 12 billion a year, a similar amount, but because it has higher, Solvay is delivering 4 billion of environmental damage for the same sales. So 30% of its sales versus 137% of its sales in environmental damage. And if you compare it with BASF, which is only delivering 10% of its sales in environmental damage, despite the fact that its sales are about 5-6 times those of Sasol and Solvay. Shouldn't we all know that? And if government knows that, won't government actually bring in impact-weighted financial accounts? So I can take you through all sorts of different industries. And some industries are naturally delivering positive or negative impact. Right. But even within these industries where negative impact is part of the industry model today, environmental impact, there are huge differences in performance. We cannot just keep investing in companies and worrying about how much money they're making without worrying about all the damage they're causing, which governments then tax us to remedy. So I believe that there needs to be redistribution of income and wealth, but I don't think it can be the solution. Our economic model is not distributing outcomes in a fair way. Our political model is not redressing that balance, but it can't redress it without changing the economic system. And the reason we're seeing these frustrations erupt into violence in places like France and Chile and Lebanon and recently in the United States is because the people who are being left behind feel that they're getting a very raw deal and they're not prepared to stand it anymore.
Sure.
So if we want a proper recovery, a just and sustainable recovery after COVID, like 1929, we need to take a big step forward in the measurement of the performance of companies. And this time, it's the measurement of their impact.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, and I'm glad that you brought it to race. I'm reminded of the fact that I believe it was Milton Friedman once said that there couldn't be systematic racial discrimination in the American workplace because the market would never allow it. And if you were a CEO foolish enough to discriminate on the basis of race, the market would discipline you for undermining the quality of your workforce. Well, we know that's ridiculous. I mean, we still live in a time when, according to surveys, a white convicted felon in the United States has an easier time getting a job than a black college-educated non-convicted felon. But I hear in what you're saying that the problem with Friedman's construction isn't that he's wrong to put it on the market. It's that we don't have enough information. The market isn't allowed to properly discipline the place. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, the market doesn't know. the market doesn't understand the number of people who are missing at every echelon of a company's hierarchy and the salaries that go with that, which clock up to billions of dollars for a company. And when you see investors optimizing risk, return, and impact because they realize that by doing so, they're investing in companies that will have more loyal consumers, more loyal talent, more loyal investors. They understand that that is a predictor of future growth and profit. And the business models of the future are going to have impact integrity at their heart if they're going to be successful. Those who just want to make money and totally ignore the damage that they're causing to the environment and to people, when this information is transparent, will be unsuccessful if they persevere.
Well, okay, so transparency really is key to what you're envisioning. Let's take some questions. We've got a lot of good questions in the queue. Here's one that goes right to your background. You mentioned that part of your interests and motives was the Middle East conflict. Could impact investment help in any way resolve the political conflict between Israel and Palestine, even if the Palestinian economy is not an independent economy due to lacking sovereignty and land and resources?
I don't think that impact investment can be a solution to robbing a population of its natural rights. But I think impact investment can be helpful in improving the economic environment in Palestine. And in fact, there are two development impact bonds in Palestine, one led by the World Bank to improve employment among unemployed young people, and the second one led by the Portland Trust and the Bank of Palestine and Paltel, which has to do with the prevention of diabetes among women living in refugee camps. So I think impact entrepreneurship, I think impact measurement and impact bonds can all play a big role in Palestine. And for instance, if you look at the creation of a high-tech sector in Palestine, using development impact bonds to train students who have graduated from university in computer science, but whose skills have not been sufficiently honed for employment in the tech sector by international companies and even Israeli companies on an outsourced basis. We have a big effort at the Portland Trust to do just that.
Interesting. Here's an interesting question that gets right into the nitty-gritty from Nick Kind. My work is advising investors and foundations across the world who want to put money into education. It's relatively easy to measure the impact outputs in some areas as there are empirical scientific measures, for example, healthcare and clean tech, but we find education to be very contextual. Cultures and values differ greatly. Can there ever be agreed shared impact investment metrics for areas like education, or do we have to find ways of improving process rather than product?
No, I think there can be, and I think the big change has to be to shift the emphasis from paying for activities to paying for outcomes. What do I mean by that? If you look today at pumping another $1 billion into grants to help education in Africa and the Middle East, for instance, you'll be met with huge skepticism because in the past, as your question suggests, it has not delivered results. But compare that with using the tools of impact investment and putting that $1 billion of philanthropic money and aid and government contributions from the first two countries where we're working, Ghana and Sierra Leone, and signing contracts with companies that or NGOs that are working in the educational field to pay them as the attainment levels that are in the contract are reached. So completing primary school and secondary school education or getting older kids to complete their vocational training and get into jobs, for example. All of a sudden, you have $1 billion that pays for outcomes. The contracts that are signed enable the delivery organizations to go to development impact bond funds, and Bridges and UBS are launching a $100 to $200 million fund at the moment for this purpose, and raise money like venture capital. The investors can stand to make 5 to 10% in dollar terms net, depending on the success. This is the way to bring systemic change to education. We're doing a similar thing in India, where we're catalyzing another $1 billion fund. And these funds over time can grow to be 10 billion or more. We think with $1 billion, we can help 10 million children and young people to complete their education.
Related question. I mean, insofar as that model would apply in the developed world, there's a lot of debate, certainly in the United States, over whether there are too many metrics, whether teachers now face this impossible position of having to teach the text to prepare for the test when they're dealing with things like the Black Lives Matter movement or police brutality against their students, poverty. Do we run the risk that impact investment further, overdoes it in terms of an over-reliance on numbers to figure out how to teach students?
I don't think in the educational field that is a major issue. I think in the educational field, where change is very difficult to bring about, what impact investment does is to enable non-state actors to help these kids not to drop out from school and to achieve attainment levels by providing them with additional mentoring, by providing their teachers with additional teaching aids, by providing their parents with advice to keep their kids in school instead of allowing them to drop out or encouraging them to drop out and get into jobs. Not everything that is worth doing can be measured. And there are, most of the philanthropic field, perhaps, is incapable of measurement. If you're thinking of improving the lives of terminally ill patients, there is no real measurement. But I think for things like education, where you can have exams which, whose results are verified, it is possible to help kids to improve hugely their education. And as we all know on the score, education is the single most powerful lever for social and economic mobility. And coming out of COVID, we're going to have a particular challenge because a lot of kids will not have gone to school for a while, and they're going to be more inclined not to go back, and so will their families. So pushing hard on education is what the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment has set out as a key objective coming out of this crisis, together with retraining the unemployed and dealing with the slums. Slum dwellers are going to be hit much harder than anyone else in this crisis because contagion is going to be so rife. And there are approaches to clearing slums, but nobody has been able to attract the investment to them. Well, impact investment can do so.
Here's an interesting question from Dahlia Dana. How do governments grapple with the fact that polluting companies with negative impacts still employ a lot of workers at a time when jobs are so badly in need? For example, Ford is a far bigger employer today than Tesla.
Right. So I think they do so, governments can do so, by having a race to the top. If you compare Ford and its employment with Daimler-Benz and its employment, I haven't looked at the figures carefully, but assuming they have similar sales and similar employment, which I think is the case, Ford is doing $1.5 billion of environmental damage a year, and Daimler is doing $1 billion. Now, as an investor or as a government looking at that, obviously what you want to do is to encourage Ford to get to where Daimler is and get Daimler to get further down than the billion. This is only through their operations. It is creating through their operations. So I think the issue of an apparent a trade-off, a real trade-off, ignores the fact that the innovation can bring us to optimize both dimensions, employment and environmental.
Gotcha. Okay.
And if you measure the pluses and minuses in impacts across the environment and social issues, then you can come to a view of what the net impact of a company is.
We've got time for a few more questions. Here's one from Alex Strakosius. What about changes in consumer behaviors? The increase in overconsumption, which, although it causes growth in economy and supports capitalism, also produces extremely negative effects from environment, et cetera. How can we tackle this to optimize consumption and become a bit more minimalistic?
I think it has to do with norms and values in society. And I do think that bringing in impact-weighted accounts, which reflect the performance of companies on that front, provides an answer to those of us who are saying today, which product should we be purchasing? Now, we've discovered through COVID that we can have this webinar instead of all of us flying to London for it. Clearly, that saves a lot of environmental damage. If impact is at the center of our consciousness and at the center of our economic system, then we will make decisions based on impact. And perhaps then we can wean ourselves away from consuming willy-nilly.
Tom Stevenson asks, what are the benefits of providing impact investment over unrestricted funding to an organization that is already delivering high quality work with demonstrable impact and a strong track record?
So what we're seeing, Tom, is that when you set objectives, measurable objectives, and you strive to achieve them, and you get to pay your investors' money back with a return, you deliver better performance than through traditional philanthropic grants. And just the availability of the data that you generate in hitting these objectives, which is usually totally lacking when an organization, a charitable organization, receives a philanthropic grant and goes out to do its best, opens the door for you to raise a huge amount more funding. So there's a very good example of this. There's an organization called Educate Girls, a philanthropic organization in India, working on preventing girls up to the age of 12 from dropping out from school. Very enlightened, unbelievable leader, a force of nature called Safina Hussain leads it. A few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, Safina raised $250,000 development impact bond. The money came from the UBS Optimus Foundation, and the Children's Investment Foundation paid for the outcomes. Safina beat her targets by 160%. The result was that she's had commitments for more than $100 million of philanthropic capital from that $250,000 social impact bond. What's the reason? She's measuring. And the investors the contributors who are giving her this philanthropic funding expect her to continue to measure, to continue to set ambitious goals like businesses do, and they will measure her performance in achieving them. So I am totally convinced from my work in the field that at least 10% of all grant programs should now be on a pay-for-success basis. investing part of the grant money into outcomes funds that pay on the basis of results. You will arm your delivery organizations, your charitable delivery organizations, with the tools that they need in order to be able to grow like a business, which is access to additional capital, both grants, but also investment, which is obviously a multiple in terms of size of the pool of philanthropic investment. I think the pool of a philanthropic investment across the world is about 1.5 trillion, and the pool of investable assets is 200 trillion.
A lot of these questions are jumping off from questions about what is it that we're measuring. People take the point that measurement is good. You can't demonstrate your effect without measurement. But what you decide to measure, of course, involves value judgments and will affect the outcome. Fiona Ellis puts it this way. It has been suggested that SIBs, social impact bonds, can encourage people to work to the target, even where in-project experience reveals that these are the wrong targets or that better ones have emerged. How can the model be adjusted to stop the contracts from getting in the way of the best outcomes?
Well, Fiona, I'm delighted you've joined us. Fiona and I sat together on the board of Big Society Capital. We're still finding our way with social impact bonds, but we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years in setting the right metrics. And we need to keep doing it. Now, can we build mechanisms into these social impact bond contracts that enable us to shift to the objectives halfway through? It's a good question. Maybe in some cases we can. But I suppose it's true of anything. It's true of business that if you focus on an objective, it may seem wise to start off with, and then subsequently it's not so wise, and you have to shift away from it, and it takes time to do so. Certainly true of government. Government programs that don't deliver results go on for a multiple of number of years of a social impact bond that doesn't deliver. So at least the great thing about the social impact bond is that after 5 years, typically, it comes to an end. And then you can improve the setting of metrics next time around.
I think we've got time for just one last question. And I think in light of the fact that we're all sitting in the midst of what is undoubtedly the worst crisis of our lives, and a global crisis at that, it's worth asking, how does social impact investing help us avoid and grapple with the next crisis?
So I think, and I'm answering your question, Peter, but I'm just taking a step back in answering it.
Sure.
I think COVID is going to accelerate the advance of impact investment. Because I think we're going to emerge from this crisis with even greater inequality. It's already obvious. Sure. The stimulus packages are going to focus on the biggest companies and the biggest financial institutions, and the most vulnerable are going to be hit the hardest. The unemployment rate is going to continue to be high because companies have got used to operating on a slimmed down basis for some months now, and they're going to try to hold on to this greater productivity. And governments are going to emerge from the crisis with a huge amount of debt. And they're not going to have the budgets to tackle these social issues, let alone all the environmental issues we've been contending with for decades now. And I think what impact investment can do is attract investment flows to the side of government to tackle these issues. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's assume that government now legislated that 2 years from now, every company would publish impact-weighted accounts. The impact of companies would be measured according to whether or not they are serving vulnerable populations, for instance. Okay? So you begin to create a mechanism which next time round can help to cope with some of the challenges that we face. And in other areas, like the development of testing, for instance, where the Global Steering Group has advocated a $10 billion program for governments to purchase tests at a fixed price and provide guarantees to investors investing in entrepreneurial companies working on tests. That's a mechanism we can use next time round. We know that there will be other pandemics. And we know that without tests, we can't avoid lockdowns. It takes too long to get to medicines and vaccines. And so if governments don't want to be short-sighted, they should be investing in this crisis, in developing the mechanisms to develop testing in the future, rather than hope that medicine and medicines and vaccines are going to make tests unnecessary. So, in short, I think that we cannot avoid but have social and economic challenges in the future.
Sure.
But by shifting to a system which has impact at its core, we give ourselves a much more powerful economic system to tackle them.
Got you. Ronnie, I just want to thank you for this really engaging back and forth. I've learned a lot from reading your book, from this conversation. The book, again, is Impact. It's available tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Paul. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for that very, very astute guiding of the conversation. Thank you, Ronnie, for those extraordinary remarks and comments. I am struck by the fact that your calls for greater transparency, both in moving from risk thinking to impact thinking and to think about impact-weighted financial accounts, is predicated on a rather simple truth, and that is the more transparent we are and the more we disclose as human beings, the more inclined we will be to do good. And I think that that is a fundamentally optimistic view of the human condition, and one that I fundamentally subscribe to. But I also think it is a call for us not to take that for granted, that contesting the public sphere, showing what our values are, arguing what we believe is good, focusing on sustainability and equality and human dignity and human rights are all things that I think are more necessary today than they have ever been. And I think that communities of people like the Conduit and like the world that you have situated yourself in for so long are going to have to demand both transparency but good values, and those two things will go together. And for your contribution to that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for hosting this wonderful event, and thank you all for joining us.
All right, everybody, stay safe and stay well, and see you next time. Thanks so much.